Okay, well, I know we've got a few questions from the audience, so can I go for the first question?
I'm Roshni and I'm 18. You said in Burma something about Burma. I've watched a video, so would you like to tell me a bit more about that?
About Burma?
Yeah.
Yes, I went to Burma just over a year ago to see for myself what was happening there. And indeed I went into across the border from Thailand into the worst refugee camp, internally displaced person camp I have ever visited. And I've seen a lot of these places which really make you cry when you see the appalling conditions that people live under and the inability of the world to do anything about it. And in Rangoon too, I was there before the uprisings last year. And I managed to meet quite a lot of interesting people who are part of the opposition there. So I got a reasonable understanding, and I met a senior member of the regime as well, where we had a full and frank discussion about what was going on in Burma at the moment. And there are a number of things that strike you, and they also strike you, I think, from the film footage of the marches that took place last year. One of the first things that strikes you is that this is an incredibly wealthy country, brought to its knees in terms of poverty by the awful rulers that they have under General Fan Shui. Also, if you look at the people who were in the front line of the marches that took place last year, they are middle-aged women. And the reason is that they were starving. They were responsible for trying to get food for their families. And there wasn't any food. And the real depths of economic poverty in Burma, a country that, as I say, is so rich, is truly horrifying. The second thing that it's worth saying is that the monks, of course, who are highly respected in Burma, were in the forefront of the marches, and the regime showed no respect at all for the monks, which is an extraordinary situation given how they are venerated in that society. And indeed they were moving ammunition and ammunition boxes and other ordnance into some of the most holy places and the pagodas in Rangoon, and putting up barbed wire around them, which is very, very offensive indeed. And then, of course, there was the efforts by the rest of the world to try and persuade the government of Burma to release Aung San Suu Kyi and the other people they have incarcerated and get a dialogue going. Because we know that eventually there will be a democratic turnaround in Burma. The question is when. And what has to happen is that the military have to be got into their rightful place in society and the politicians given the space to get into theirs. And that should be the direction that all of us go in. We then had the problems in the Irrawaddy Delta and the appalling cyclone, which left so many hundreds of thousands of people homeless in Burma, and the obscene reaction of the regime not to allow into the Delta the aid that was available from the ships that were loaded to the gunwales with accommodation, medicine, and ways of helping these poor people who were in such a desperate condition in the Delta. So a lot has been going on. Burma remains a terrible place, badly led by people who, in my view, should be brought before the International Criminal Court. And one of the problems is that the public spotlight now is off Burma, which is a great pity. But I just mentioned one point that is an effect of globalization, which is that back in 1988, when there was a massacre in Burma, it was a very long time before we knew that hundreds of people who supported Aung San Suu Kyi had been killed in this massacre. Some months. And yet last year, we actually saw the regime execute a Japanese photographer in real time on television because of the way in which the 24-hour-a-day media is globalized and was able to pick it up. And that's why I say, eventually the regime will be forced by circumstances to give way. And it seems to me what all of us, especially the United Nations actually, and the other ASEAN nations, because they're the ones with the real strength to influence the regime there, need to be moving towards, is a negotiation with the legitimate political parties and the space opened up for them to take their rightful role in Burmese society.
You mentioned that the public spotlight has gone off Burma.
Yes.
What do you think about celebrity involvement in international issues, you know, to kind of...
Yes.
I mean, for example, I'm thinking about Naomi Campbell signing up to Sarah Brand's White Ribbon Alliance, which is on trying to reduce the amount of women dying in childbirth recently. What's your opinion on this?
I think there is a role for that, and I'll tell you the best example that I have seen is on Darfur, where China is very involved in Darfur and we believe should exercise more influence on the regime in Khartoum, General Bashir's regime. And quite interesting that when Hollywood went to Beijing before the Games and said to the Chinese authorities, look, you know, you need to do something about what's happening in Darfur because otherwise these will be known as the Genocide Olympics. Very rapidly, the Chinese government sent not one but two envoys to Darfur to negotiate with the Darfur and Khartoum government about what was happening in Darfur. And that was, to me, an example of the effect that celebrity involvement can have. That wasn't something that the politicians or the UN had been able to do until that point. So I thought that was impressive, and I think that if you look at what Bob Geldof has done to shame governments and politicians into doing more and to articulate views of ordinary people about the moral responsibility for rich countries to take action, I think that too is a very good thing.
Great, okay, can we go to our next question from the audience? Could you put your hands up if you've got one, please? Thank you.
I'm Nab, I'm 18. What criteria do you use to assess the effectiveness of the UK's aid budget, and how could that effectiveness be enhanced? For example, international growth, economical growth would lead to economical inflation as well, as in how would you balance that out?
Well, on your second point, it's not a sort of zero-sum game. I mean, economic growth doesn't necessarily lead to inflation. It depends on the nature of the economic growth. But on the point about evaluating aid, you're onto an extremely important issue because, firstly, there isn't really any independent aid evaluation in Britain. And we have said that we will set up an independent aid evaluation agency which will report to Parliament, not to the government, and which will look at the effectiveness of our aid programme. And, you know, in politics you have to be open and honest enough to say, you know, I'm big enough to allow external evaluation. I'm not going to keep it all behind closed doors so that the world can learn what works and what doesn't work. And, you know, there will be things that don't work and that the evaluation agency says aren't working properly, and we will need to address that. When it happens. So we will set up the sort of evaluation which you rightly suggest we should have and which we don't have at the moment. Now, there is another point as well, which is in times of hardship, you will not retain the support amongst the British public for paying their taxes into development and aid unless you can demonstrate that it is truly effectively used. You see, for the last 10 years, international development has operated in a very benign climate where you haven't had to choose between schools in Africa and schools down the road. You haven't had to choose between building health capacity in Africa and building health capacity in your local area or in Britain. But in a time of straitened economic concern and financial stringency, which I fear we are approaching, those are very real choices, and people will only accept and embrace the moral imperative of standing true to our 0.7% pledge if they know that that aid is spent effectively. And that is another very important reason why we need to set up an independent aid evaluation agency, so that we can give taxpayers confidence that their money is truly being well spent.